All right, welcome back to the Evangelization and Culture Show. I'm Matt Nelson, and here as always with Jared Zimmerer. And today we're sitting down with Andrew Petiprin. So Andrew is our newest member of the Word on Fire Institute. He's our Fellow of Popular Culture, and he's got a wild past that he's going to talk about in this interview, which was super interesting. He was raised an evangelical. He was eventually ordained an Episcopal priest, and just 1 year ago he entered the Catholic Church. So we're going to talk about not just his faith journey, but also his role as the Fellow of Popular Culture, and we'll talk to him a little bit about some of his favorite films and books and stuff like that. So it's a great interview.
Yeah, looking forward to it. I mean, this was, it's funny because Father Steve Gruno actually pointed out Andrew's work and said, hey, I think you should keep an eye on this guy. And the more I read of what he was providing, and then I ended up contacting him, we had several conversations. I was just, kind of blown away at his understanding of culture. He has a thorough theological and philosophical background that we kind of go into in this interview. But just overall, I mean, he's just got this ability to view popular culture through a Christian lens that's a very Baronian style, a lot like Bishop Barron, as we say. And so I just think he's going to provide so much expertise and talent and perspective for the Institute that it'll just be a great treasure for our Institute members for sure.
Yeah, no, we're blessed to have him here, and I think we should just jump right to the interview. Let's go to it. All right, we're here with Andrew Petiprin, our newest Word on Fire Institute Fellow. Thanks for joining us, Andrew.
Glad to be here.
It's good to finally have you here with us in the office, and today we're going to be talking about a lot of things. You're the Fellow of Popular Culture, so we're going to be talking a lot about popular culture today, but let's start by doing a little bit of a biographical sketch of your life, because it's been an interesting journey up till now. So let me start with a simple question. Were you raised Catholic, which I think everybody watching this probably knows by now from the content they heard at the beginning of this that you're not, but why don't you tell us a little bit about your religious upbringing in the beginning?
Well, no, I was not raised Catholic. I've been a Catholic for just over 1 year, as a matter of fact, but it's all been a long journey towards becoming Catholic. I was raised evangelical in a very Jesus-loving, Bible-reading home, all very positive. We would sing, we would pray together as a family. Just a really wonderful, rich, religious home life for sure. My mom was an English teacher as well, so it was always from the beginning for me. Our faith was always connected to literature and things that we were watching and listening to and that sort of thing. So, when I think all the way back to my childhood, my mom reading like the creation story to us, in my mind, I have Narnia or Middle Earth. Nice. I have sort of these touchstones of literature and visual things as well. So yeah, I was raised in an evangelical home, and we were a very serious Christian family for a long time. My parents got divorced when I was 13, and that kind of shook the faith of our family, and I became kind of certainly not opposed to Christianity or anything like that, but much more critical than I was before. I was also a teenager at that time, which is just a naturally rebellious time.
Sure.
I was pretty arrogant, I think, about religion too. I used to go to church with my mom, and I used to think that the pastors were just not very smart and didn't know what they were talking about, which was extremely arrogant. I mean, what did I know? I didn't know what I was talking about. But a seed was planted there, I think, for a kind of leadership in Christian ministry and in evangelism and speaking and teaching and that sort of thing, because from these early memories, I wanted to talk about religion, and I wanted to talk about faith, and I wanted to be somebody who possessed knowledge that I could share with other people. So I just kind of wandered around through different churches and things like that until in 2001, I went to England and I studied at Oxford University for a couple of years. And it was there that I became an Anglican. I joined the Church of England, and a lot of it was influenced for me by some of my heroes, people like C.S. Lewis and T.S. Eliot, people whose work I had admired and read for a long time. And I suddenly found myself in the very place where they had lived and practiced their faith. So I was confirmed in the Church of England and began thinking about ministry in that tradition.
So before we talk about the next step along your journey, let's go back and talk a little bit about you becoming Anglican.
Sure.
I'm curious to know, was that a decision that was in motion before going to Oxford, or did you go to Oxford and you were just kind of hit by the Anglican lightning bolt, and that just like suddenly made it really real, that desire to become Anglican really real? Or how did that all work for you?
It had been in motion for sure before that, but I didn't really know it until I got there, and until I had actually worshipped in an Anglican church. I'd never really done that much before, and but yeah, beforehand, I went to England at the end of the summer 2001, actually right after 9/11 happened. It was in September, and I realized in retrospect that I was in a personal crisis at the same time that our world was kind of in upheaval. So, going all the way back to my early childhood and my religious upbringing, the first place I wanted to sort of go in this new place when I was in tumult was to the church, was to a place of worship and community and fellowship. Yeah. And there's just tons of that on offer if you know where to look for it in a place like Oxford. Even though England is such a secular country, there are all these college chapels with all these little services going on all over the place. So I just started going, and the college chaplain was one of the first people I met. And I soon began running with this group of friends who were what we would call Anglo-Catholic. And they really helped me to understand, rightly or wrongly, that I was participating in something like Catholicism anyway.
Do you think part of it was, you had mentioned that kind of growing up, you kind of had this moment where you felt like maybe the intellectual life and the religious life, there was maybe a dichotomy between the two, whereas at Oxford, you kind of have a joining of the two, right? Yeah.
That's exactly the way that it felt for me. I was around really smart Christians for the first time in my life who were also faithful. I mean, they were serious believers, and they lived their lives according to this rhythm that I had never experienced before. They got up and went to Holy Communion every morning, and every evening, because it was Oxford, we got to sit in this beautiful choral evensong service every single night. Yeah. And I just could never have imagined something like this. Except that I knew a little bit about it from reading people like C.S. Lewis. And suddenly there I was, 50 years or something later, after C.S. Lewis's own time, sitting in the same building, Magdalen College Chapel, where he had prayed every day. Wow. So that was just kind of irresistible for me as a fan of his.
What did you study at Oxford?
I studied European literature, mostly medieval and Renaissance stuff. In fact, French literature, of all things. I went all the way to England to study French, but it was a wonderful experience.
Yeah, because you're fluent in French, right?
Oui, un peu, oui. I guess so. I'm a bit rusty, but I do speak French.
That's awesome. So were there, we actually talked about this before, were there certain influences maybe while you were at Oxford that kind of brought you into Anglicanism that maybe became your intellectual heroes, more specifically there? Because you had said C.S. Lewis kind of going into it. Yeah. And I'm also a literature guy, so I think literature can play a role even in the growth of the intellectual life and all of that. Were there any specific influences there?
Well, in my undergraduate, I had never studied any theology, really. Okay. And I was suddenly around some people who were pretty interested in theology, and especially in people like the Fathers. Yeah. So for me, to be exposed to... I had read Augustine's Confessions before and that sort of thing, but to really be around people whose lives were formed by theology, by people like Augustine and people like that was really big for me. And plus, like I said, I was with this group who were kind of self-professed Anglo-Catholics. So there was sort of a whole bunch of writers like John Henry Newman, though obviously his path went in a different direction, as mine eventually would too. But people like John Keble, Edward Pusey, people like that I had never heard of before, and I was exposed to for the first time.
It's the Oxford movement guys, right?
That's right.
Yeah. I wondered how much of an influence they would have had on you at that stage of the journey.
For sure.
Really interesting. Well, we want to talk more about Newman in a few minutes, but let's move forward then with your journey forward. So you leave Oxford, and then what's next?
I left Oxford and I went back to Florida, where I'm from, and taught high school for 3 years. Mm-hmm. I reconnected with my wife, whom I had known from years previously, got married, and then the two of us decided to embark on a new adventure to move to New Haven, Connecticut, where I started studying at Yale Divinity School and training for ministry in the Episcopal Church. And that was a super formative time for me in my young married life, and then, of course, in my life of faith as well. I really sunk my teeth into theology and philosophy and, just really meaty stuff. And came out the other side ordained in the Episcopal Church, and then embarked upon close to 10 years, 8+ years of actual ministry in a parish before the call came really just undeniably that it was time to become Catholic.
What was it like to go to Yale as a religious man? Because Leah Labresco, one of our fellows of the Institute, she also attended there. Talking to her and talking to others who have attended Yale, you get the impression it's a pretty secular campus. So what was your experience like there as somebody who believes in God and is actively practicing the Christian faith?
Well, for me, the divinity school is somewhat apart from other aspects of Yale, but I had a student job that was right in the midst of the main campus, and I was working with undergraduates. And I have to say, by the time I arrived there, I had been out of college myself for several years. And I have to say, I noticed a change from just the time that I graduated from college to the time that I went to Yale in kind of the general demeanor of undergraduates. I really could see in this just a few years later, much less allegiance, adherence to religion and that sort of thing. And another bit of it might be just the elite environment of Yale. It just kind of lends itself maybe to people who are coming from a more skeptical background. But it was great for me. My wife and I have very happy memories from those 3 years that we spent at Yale. I was already married at the time, so I had kind of my own life going that was kind of apart from the student life. But I don't regret going there at all. It was very interesting, both from what I learned from really knowledgeable and faithful teachers, but then also being able to contrast it with what I saw in the formation of the elite happening that I'm sure probably Leah can talk a lot more about, or people who are like undergraduates at Yale.
Wow. So in this period of your life, you're now a Episcopalian priest. You're serving the church in that way. So what was kind of the journey for the next 8 years for you?
Yeah. Well, backing up just a little bit, I mean, I always had in my mind and in my heart this struggle about whether I was in the right place, about whether I was supposed to be Anglican or supposed to be Catholic, or whether there was a way to be Anglican and Catholic sort of at the same time, which is certainly the way that some of my friends would view things. Yeah. And I go all the way back to the death of John Paul II and watching his funeral and the election of Pope Benedict. And I remember that a seed was planted at that moment where unconsciously I knew one day I was going to be a Roman Catholic. However, that was really unconscious, and I sort of kept moving forward with my life in Anglicanism for a time, but that never left me, that feeling that I experienced during that. And it's funny because since I've converted, I've talked to a lot of other people who also pinpoint that as a moment where there was just a real outpouring of grace, where conversion seeds were sown.
I want to stop you there because I want to ask you some questions about this. So I'm going to put you on the spot. At this point, how confident are you that you're in the church that Christ founded in all fullness? That how compared to where you were when you were in the Anglican church, psychologically, right, where are you now as a Catholic?
I'm absolutely certain that I'm in the church.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think about in John Henry Newman's Apologia, the chapter that begins right after he talks about his conversion. He talks about how basically his whole life up to that point had been like on a boat in rocky seas, and he'd come in to port. And, even though his life was very difficult, as all lives are difficult, he had this overwhelming sense for the rest of his life that he knew he had arrived where he had been sent. And I absolutely feel that way.
So when we were talking off air about this part of your journey, we talked a little bit about Roman Catholicism and how you kind of saw that during your time at Oxford and as an Anglican. And you just talked about your experience with John Paul II, watching his funeral, and having some unrest because of what you seem to be intuiting about something true there that you didn't quite have your finger on, or that you thought someday maybe you'd be Catholic. What was it like to read the, quote unquote, Pope passages in the scriptures like Matthew 16, those parts of the scriptures that we would point to, and there's a lot there that suggests that Peter was at least a chief among the apostles, and many Protestants would give us that much. It's just they stop short of what we today see as the papacy. But what was it like for you to read those passages before you were Catholic? Did it cause you unrest, or?
It did. But, I belonged to a group, or maybe it was just a group of one, I don't know. But, I tended to think that we had a vocation, that Anglicans and others had a vocation to become Catholic. The question was just how that was going to happen, whether that would happen in some kind of corporate way in, centuries from now or something like that. And ultimately, I really just came to believe that the Lord was calling me now, and that the ecumenical spirit of the age was essentially the church being able to tell me that I had gifts to bring in. So I've just felt overwhelmingly welcomed and really came to identify that as the way to go.
Okay. Wow. So now we're kind of getting closer to your conversion to Catholicism specifically. What were some of the maybe moments or influences that started to make you really decide, okay, this is what I want to do?
Well, when I look back, it's all of a piece. It's all in line. There's a timeline that you can sort of see that things are going in that direction, for sure. But the actual impetus to do it is, I think, a kind of inexplicable work of grace. The Lord brought me and my family from a pastoral situation where I was ministering in a church down in Florida, brought me up to Tennessee where I was working on a diocesan staff in the Episcopal Diocese of Tennessee. And from that point on, I just really, it was just weighing on me very heavily. It was almost as if during those times when I was in parish ministry, I just had to keep my head down and focus on tending to my people's needs. But the Lord brought me out of that into a place where I could do some more contemplation and soul searching. And at the same time, I was found myself in this ecumenical reading group with some Roman Catholics who really continued to just extend that warm welcome, that generosity of spirit. We read some ecumenical texts together, like Ut Unum Sent by John Paul II, and it was just building. And I really want to highlight the fact that when the moment finally came, and my wife and I just talked about this so much and worked it out together, it was very much running towards the Catholic Church rather than feeling like we were running away from something.
Yeah. Sure.
And that was a key change that happened in my heart that I wasn't expecting, because I had my frustrations with Anglicanism and my frustrations with the Episcopal Church in particular. But in the end, it wasn't really, our conversion wasn't really rooted in just not wanting to participate in that stuff anymore, but much more just wanting to experience all the gifts that the church has to offer.
Wow. So was your wife on board pretty much the whole time? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we had talked about a lot over the years together, and something that she wasn't surprised when I finally came home one day and I said, look, I think now's the time. I think this is it. The problem was it just made no sense for us practically. It made no sense in our lives. I mean, I was making really good money actually as an Episcopal priest, and I was in a relatively influential and somewhat prestigious position. And it just didn't make any sense to quit all of that and just leave it behind. But that's the way the Lord works. That's just absolutely how it works. So.
Wow. It kind of reminds me of a Chesterton quote in the Catholic Church and Conversion. And I'm not going to be able to quote it verbatim, but he says something like, once you stop pulling away from the church, you'll feel a tug towards the church. And once you stop fearing the church, you'll feel fond of the church. Does that ring true with you in your experience? Or
Absolutely. Yeah, getting over the fear was really big. And again, for me, St. John Paul II was a huge intercessor, encouragement. I mean, his motto, be not afraid. I just was constantly praying that and thinking that. Because you don't know what you're getting into. And, all these years sort of admiring the Catholic Church, it's still, the reality of actually just doing it and being in it and making that break it's very daunting. And I understand. I'm in conversation right now with a lot of people who are thinking about converting, but those practical steps, there's just, can I really do it? There's a lot of roadblocks.
Yeah, for sure. And we had mentioned, or you had mentioned to me before as well, that in fact, whenever we were talking to you about this position for popular culture, that you've been a fan of Bishop Barron for quite some time, even prior to your conversion. So what was maybe the introduction there, and in what ways were you using maybe his materials?
Well, I'll tell you, it's really funny. I had a parishioner when I was an Episcopal priest who came to me and said that she had been going to RCIA at the local Catholic parish, and she was not going to become Catholic. She just went with a friend. But they were using Bishop Barron's Catholicism series in the RCIA class. And she said, you're just not even going to believe how fantastic this is. I'd never heard of Bishop Barron, never heard of the series, but she bought it and gave it to me. And I watched the whole thing and I was completely mesmerized by it. And so I did it with my parishioners. We put it on. We rebranded it a little bit. I probably shouldn't say this to the Word on Fire, but I mean, we couldn't call it Catholicism because we weren't a Catholic church, so we called it just like, something else. But that's
Anglo-Catholicism.
Yeah, maybe. We made up some title, but we watched it, and my people, the ones who showed up anyway, were totally mesmerized by it. And I remember specifically watching the one where Bishop Barron is talking about the Eucharist. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, I think my people are going to really like this. But after we watched the video, I think I better kind of like smooth this over a little bit for them because, I'm not sure they can handle like transubstantiation. Like, how can we? And so I start giving this little talk to my people afterwards, and somebody just raised their hand. They're like, no, he did great. Like Bishop Barron, we don't need you to explain like anymore. Like, we're fine with all of this. So we did that twice in my parish. We did the new evangelization. I used Bishop Barron's resources. But bigger than that too, I, like so many people who have come to faith because of the Word on Fire ministries, I started watching Bishop Barron's videos, his film critiques in particular, and I thought to myself, this is what I want to be about. This kind of engagement with the culture, this kind of faithful posture towards the world is right on. And so, honestly, it's a dream come true to actually get to participate in that work now.
Now you're here.
Now I'm here.
It's so crazy. Like 1 year after you entered the church formally, you're now working with Bishop Barron as the Fellow of Popular Culture. Yeah. And it was his YouTube commentaries on the films that really captured you. And that's just Providence at his best. So we're really happy to have you on board. And we're just going to keep on picking your brain here while we've got you in studio. So before we start talking about some of your favorite films and other aspects of popular culture that have really influenced you, let's circle back to Newman. We're riding the Newman train right now because he was canonized not too long ago, and
we just finished the course.
Yeah, exactly.
Bishop Barron's course on John Henry Newman, the Institute.
Exactly. So I want to ask you now. What kind of an influence has St. John Henry Newman had on your journey? Maybe before, if any, and then now as a Catholic?
Well, now as a Catholic, I half jokingly have told people that if they were not able to find a second miracle, that they should have just come and talked to me. Because I really do believe he has interceded powerfully for me and for my family and for a lot of other people out there who are making the journey into the Catholic Church now. I think he is just such a great saint for our age. Yeah. I really do. And obviously that's something Bishop Barron teaches and that Word on Fire is about with regard to St. John Henry Newman as well. For me, before I was Catholic, as part of my Anglican formation, we certainly read Newman. But at least some of my mentors and influences were people who, I would say, kind of regarded Newman's conversion as a tragedy. They loved Newman, but it made them sad that he couldn't convert, and maybe that he did convert.
Understandably.
Yeah. I mean, for sure. He's one of your own, and maybe the best and the brightest of your own, and then he goes over. So what that meant for me is that I read a lot of Newman. I certainly knew his sermons and everything, but in my formation, I really didn't engage much with him in his work after 1845, after he converted. And that very much included his essay on the development of Christian doctrine, which I read very carefully in the year leading up to being received and confirmed in the church. And I really came around to thinking that it's just one of the most important things ever written, just one of the most important documents that we have in the church. And I would go so far as to say, I really think that people who have any inkling that they might be interested in Catholicism really need to read it and engage with it seriously, whatever decision they end up making about the church. It's that important.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, I'm interested to know with the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, which is kind of his back and forth with Charles Kingsley.
Yeah.
If there's any interest, and like maybe you can speak to this, among Anglicans of reading that to see what Kingsley had to say to this great apologist of the 20th century for the Catholic faith. Is that something that Anglicans do nowadays? Are they interested in that work? Or?
I think so. I don't know many people who would be very sympathetic to Charles Kingsley, to be honest. Okay. I don't really think it boils down to that. I think that a lot of Anglicans read it and they enjoy Newman's account of what the church was like during that era in those first few chapters in particular. The other thing that I've always thought about the Apologia is how generous Newman is to his Anglican past, to himself as a former Anglican.
Sure.
And I think this is something converts need to do. They shouldn't have disdain for who they were or
Right.
what they used to believe.
Yeah.
You know, it's all part of God's plan.
Which is really common among converts
Yeah.
to Catholicism, former Protestants. I don't know if I've ever met a Protestant, now Catholic, who talks with contempt about their former evangelical or mainstream Protestant faith. Like there they were first given their love for the scriptures and their love and desire for that personal relationship with Jesus. And there's so much to be offered. It's just that there's sort of like not so much a deletion, but a perfection in a way when you become Catholic and enter the church. But the opposite seems to be true for Catholics who leave the church for, say, evangelicalism or, any other denomination. It seems way more common for ex-Catholics to have that contempt.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you would say the same thing or...
I would. I certainly experienced that with some of the people that I ministered to when I was an Episcopal priest. They had been in the Catholic Church. Some of them had had bad experiences or, various parts of their own life story that caused them to leave the Catholic Church. And sometimes I was the one who had to say to them, "Hey, whoa, ease up now. Don't be so hard on yourself. Don't be so hard on the church."
Yeah. And I wonder if maybe a lot of times when people leave we can't put everyone in a box,
Right.
but when people leave the Catholic Church, a lot of times I wonder if it's for emotional reasons, a bad run-in with a priest or with a fellow parishioner or whatever. But a lot of times, in your case and in many converts' cases, coming to Catholicism it's very much an emotional, experiential, psychological experience, but it's also very intellectual.
Mm-hmm.
You got to think your way into the Catholic Church because to become Catholic nowadays, like you're making a statement to friends and family, like, I don't care what the popular opinion is. There's something here I need to be a part of. So anyways, drifting away from the popular culture topic here.
Well, speaking of popular culture, obviously now you're our all new fellow in popular culture. And so I wanted to kind of dive into, and it sounds like, culture played a role even in your childhood leading up to, and of course you studied literature and all that in school. But I did want to get into kind of like why we chose the name of popular culture and why we think that's very specific to today's needs of evangelical work. You had mentioned that, Bishop Barron's film reviews and all of that was something that was just very attractive to you. But why popular culture in particular?
Well, I remember, Jared, actually, when you and I and Father Steve talked once early on when we were talking about, you all were talking to me about this wonderful position. And I remember Father Steve Gruno asked whether I loved the world. And then he evoked the name of Cardinal George, whom I know Bishop Barron talks about
he's
a lot.
The grandfather of Word on Fire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my answer was, yes, I do love the world because Jesus loved the world so much that he died for it. And therefore the culture is not something just to be universally disdained or discarded, right? The world's destiny is not to be thrown on the trash can, but to be made new. And so it seems to me just basic Christian duty to engage with the culture, not to shun it just out of hand. Having said that, though, there are lots of things that are very popular that, as Catholics in particular, we have to differentiate from. And we have to do that lovingly, charitably, carefully, in ways that don't turn people off. But I think it's absolutely fair game, and then some, to watch films, listen to music, read books, and to offer to the culture ways of engaging those things that are edifying. Yeah. I find nowadays there are books, films, all sorts of things that have messages in them that are perfectly compatible with our faith, but aren't necessarily overtly stated. That's the way art works. Yeah. And so I think it's just really important that we engage with that and that we do that work.
Yeah, and I think especially in kind of the ease of access and the internet age, so many times we get emails from people that say, hey, I was actually vehemently anti-Catholic, but then I happened to either stumble upon Jordan Peterson or I love Bob Dylan, and then that led me to Bishop Barron, and then I watched all of his film reviews, and then that made me go, oh, okay, Catholics know something about what they were talking about, and then it led them eventually, years later into the church. And so I think that popular culture allows for just that. It's a populace where we're kind of involved in that. And I think that the point of saying that, we love the world, we love the culture, is because when you love something, you're able to kind of walk that tight line between critiquing as well as loving it, right? So it's kind of like with your family members. You can critique certain behaviors, but they know they love you. There's this kind of foundation of trust that's involved. So whenever we talk about, I constantly hear this term culture wars. It drives me nuts because it's not an us versus them thing.
Right.
Like we're all in this thing together. But that love alone allows you to kind of critique things that are false. And so when we're talking about, obviously, popular culture, we're talking about films, music, books. What is it? Is there any kind of aspect of popular culture that you are really drawn to specifically?
Well, I've always loved literature, and I've always loved film.
Yeah.
I really think that the visual medium is always really, really powerful. It's certainly powerful for us as Catholics. I mean, to be able to walk into a beautiful building, especially if the sacrament is present, and to gaze on the Lord and all that sort of thing. And that's always been the case. I mean, iconoclasm is a heresy. Yeah. It is. Yeah. So when we are able to look at media that are beautiful, well, just as Bishop Barron always talks about, there we may very well also find truth and goodness. So yeah, I've always been a huge film fan, classic film fan. Alfred Hitchcock, all the great sort of early masters for sure. But more recently, I love kind of quirky stuff like Wes Anderson, Terry Gilliam, Jim Jarmusch. Kind of offbeat type stuff that very often has some pretty profound things to say about the human experience and the way that we relate to our Creator.
So, can you name some of their films?
Sure. One of my favorite films of all time is a Terry Gilliam film called Fisher King, which stars Robin Williams and Jeff somebody or other who's very famous, the guy who plays the Big Lebowski. Jeff Bridges, right? Sorry.
Don't look at Matt Nelson if you're going to talk film, because I'm growing in this area. But yeah.
So that's a really great kind of like modern day Arthurian kind of thing. It's really neat. I love Wes Anderson. I love kind of like the family tales that he tells in movies like Rushmore and The Royal Tenenbaums and things like that. Very offbeat, not always entirely appropriate or consonant with like the practice of the Catholic faith, but also not far off from understanding the kind of complexity of the human experience. So I love stuff like that. Obviously I love just good filmmaking that is unabashedly inspiring as well. Movies like Chariots of Fire, things like that are just super important to me in my life, just the kinds of things that I go back to again and again. But I also love kind of fun things like, one of my favorite films of all time is Top Gun. So really looking forward to the new Top Gun.
Nice.
It's just I love to engage with all of it and just see what there is to gain. I've always loved literature, both old and new, and have a lot of experience with medieval and Renaissance stuff, but I also love modern literature. I love especially kind of quirky sci-fi stuff. I don't know, quirky is like the key thing for me this time, but whatever. Like people like Kurt Vonnegut even like sci-fi stuff like Philip K. Dick things like that, which are enjoying kind of a renaissance now in things like Black Mirror and stuff like that, where these kind of like dystopian things provide us a window into thinking about what kind of world we really are supposed to be living in, and what kind of world we live in where God reigns.
Yeah.
Is there any aspect of pop culture that has really had its effect on you that you really did not expect? So like an unexpected film or song or book that's contemporary that you maybe decided to take it in a pretty leisurely fashion with low expectations, and then it just kind of hits you and you're like, wow, didn't expect that.
I don't know. I watch a lot of these British mystery things, and sometimes I just watch them because they're just kind of easy to watch. They go down really easy, and but then sometimes they're really profound. And Jared and I were just talking the other day about the film Knives Out. Yeah. Which that really surprised me, how powerful kind of the message of the triumph of virtue over vice was, and some other themes that I think map really well onto our lives as Catholics and as Christians.
Yeah, I think that was one of the best films of last year.
Yeah, for sure.
Just phenomenal. And is there any aspects? One thing that you'll be offering Institute members as well as many of our followers is interpretations of popular culture, and one of those kind of aspects or a skill that you bring to the Institute is being able to read culture through a Catholic lens. What are some of maybe like the guiding lights? Because, we are willing and able to view really any part of popular culture as long as it doesn't lead us towards, some sinful behavior. Sure. But as Catholics, we do need to be aware of what's out there, and obviously not carte blanche just to appreciate everything that's out there. So how can Catholics kind of view culture rightly?
Yeah. For me, one of the most important figures is St. Augustine. And, his understanding of who God is and who a human being is, what a human being is, that we are made in God's image. God is not made in our image. And keeping that distinction very clear. Augustine also makes the distinction between use and enjoyment. So there's nothing that we should be trying to enjoy in its own right other than God himself. But en route to enjoying God, there's all kinds of stuff that we can use. And that's really the important thing about the way that we engage with culture. So for me, Augustine is a really key figure. And then a lot of others who I would call Augustinian figures are important in that way too. Maybe Pope Benedict XVI for sure. And his critique of what he called a culture of relativism. And at the same time, if you dig deeply into the stuff that he writes and talks about, you'll find somebody who also loves the world very much and desires its transformation, but wants to be very careful that we as Catholics are maintaining a standard of understanding who God is and what we are, that we're distinct.
Yeah. And how much does a biblical worldview help with the way we read culture?
Very, very much. I mean, and again, going all the way back to my evangelical childhood, I was given the gift of having Bible stories just kind of like enmeshed in my life. So I think that if you have a good grounding in the basic stories of the Bible, it really helps to process stories that are going on in films or TV shows or books that you read, that sort of thing, and to really come to an understanding of the way God may be at work. These tropes of life, death, resurrection, things like that, to sort of just be pre-programmed to look for those kinds of things, and then to be able to point to them and point to the culture and say, aha, here we have it. We have it in a film.
Yeah. I also think the biblical treatment of violence
and
a lot of vice is very interesting. Of course, you're reading it in a more literary form, but it provides a lens by which we can even read popular culture whenever you watch something that maybe has some violence in it or perhaps some sexual innuendo or something of that nature, that this is something that has been the human problem since the beginning. And if you are able to trace it back, it always goes back to either a sin or a breaking of the relationship with God. So it provides the ability to kind of just read these things without necessarily just judging them and saying this is just trash.
Yeah, and speaking of judging, has anyone read the book of Judges, right? or First and Second Kings or something? I mean, my goodness.
Yeah, and the thing about Catholicism is like, this is, although it's suffused with mystery, there's much about the faith that is accessible to the natural light of human reason. Yeah. And we think about how St. Thomas Aquinas could go to Aristotle. He could go to Avicenna. He could go to
Maimonides.
Yeah, he could go outside of the Christian faith and find these natural truths, if we want to call it that, truths that sort of precede and build a bridge to the Catholic faith and to the mysteries that we believe. Take Aristotle's teachings on virtue and vice, for example. You just mentioned vice. You can watch film or read books or even listen to music and find in the lyrics, some kind of a portrayal of virtue and vice, and begin to learn about these sort of pre-Christian ideas that eventually will like move you closer to the faith. And so I think like sometimes it really is those films that are in no way explicitly religious, in no way explicitly Christian, that are actually what people need. People need to be taught these sort of preliminary truths about reality. And then by discovering those things, that's kind of like one more rung closer to climbing that. Let's get real poetic and say Jacob's ladder or something like that.
Well, it reminds me of, I'm diving pretty deep into Charles Taylor right now with the whole buffered self thing.
I like to call him Chuck Taylor.
Chucky, good old Chucky. Yeah. He's got the shoes named after him. But he, talking about the buffered self, and it reminded me of, Bishop Barron says one of the greatest Catholic movies in recent times was Gran Torino. And that was not specifically going to be a Catholic film.
Yeah.
But it does break through this kind of inverted buffered self. It what he calls punches holes through it. And it's because it's lensed behind just a beautiful film. It's just a great film, great story, great character development. Yet the Christian narrative comes through and is able to bust through it.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, that's Charles Taylor is a great person for us to maybe discuss in a future episode with you, Andrew, with his A Secular Age and this whole idea of the buffered self and the porous self, and how we used to live in an enchanted world where we recognized that there was reality beyond the sensible, whereas now we're kind of boxed into this kind of materialistic type reality that is only a partial reality. So I was just thinking maybe a little bit of brainstorming on air. We should talk about that in the future.
Well, I think a lot of great films and cultural offerings are speaking directly to that. A film that I really loved from the last decade was the film The Social Network, which really is prophetic in looking ahead. I mean, it came out 3 years after the iPhone appeared, and it sort of chronicles how we have moved into this sort of era of self-construction and sort of becoming your own avatar, being surrounded by friends, and yet feeling incredibly disconnected and lonely.
There's I think it's Ralph Wood, and I think are you familiar with Ralph Wood?
No.
He's a scholar of Flannery O'Connor and J.R.R. Tolkien. But he is not Catholic. I think he's Baptist. Anyways, he's written a great book on the Lord of the Rings, and he talks about how the ring that makes Frodo invisible is somewhat emblematic of what the internet is for us today. It's almost like it's too much for us. In a way, we're all over the world in an invisible form, but it's too much. And even though it certainly can serve the greater good, too often it gets abused because it's all too much power for us to handle, and it leads us down the wrong path. So he draws an interesting parallel there.
Yeah. And of course, two of the principles that we operate on at the Institute is evangelization of the culture, which obviously we've been going kind of into what that means, what that looks like. But then also leading with beauty, which is, of course, what we're talking about with these films and books and all that kind of stuff. And so, a lot of people particularly Christians, tend to look at things of the popular culture and not necessarily see things that are beautiful. So what are some of the ways in which we can recognize, even in a dark way, maybe, that's beautiful? Because immediately when you said Flannery O'Connor, I immediately thought of the fact that she particularly wrote dark and startling figures, but in a kind of beautiful way, kind of breaks through in a beautiful way. And Walker Percy did the same thing, and they did that for very strategic reasons.
Yeah. Well, beauty is one of those things that is both simple and complex. And the culture often offers things that are sort of neither one nor the other, strangely. There's this sort of artificiality that doesn't allow for a kind of face value that's attractive, or for something where with repeated viewings or digging in is going to provide a lot more richness, So I think as Catholics, where we can identify things in the culture that are truly beautiful in the sense of both simple and complex, I think that will really be helping people along, because it is really hard to tell, and it's not like I'm advocating some kind of elitism or something where we get to decide what's beautiful or something like that. I mean, who are we to judge? But at the same time, it is nice for people who have thought a lot about these things to be able to offer an opinion and to offer a view and to say, hey, look, here's the way this is speaking to me in a deep way. Yeah. And to me, it's speaking in a deep way, in the same way that, the grand tradition of beautiful things does, listening to a Beethoven symphony or going to an art museum and looking at a painting by Vermeer or something like that. When you watch a movie like The Revenant or something like that, something that is on the surface, a very simple story to understand, but is also just so multi-layered. Yeah. You can say, aha, that's beauty. Yeah. There is something there that is going to open up to that truth and that goodness.
I think it also kind of opens up our minds to just the modern culture and perhaps the way in which modern culture thinks of itself. You know, kind of like you had mentioned about the Social Network film. I immediately thought of kind of this problem of today, heroes are most often anti-heroes, or they're at least broken heroes. Yeah. So there's not really like a clear, simple, who is the hero? It's not Superman from the 50s, right? It's a totally different era now. And I think that as Christians, as Catholics, when we're going out evangelizing to help better understand, well, how does the modern mind work? Mm-hmm. That actually provides a little bit of a lens of maybe this is the way the world thinks now, that truly heroes can't be true heroes, as in the Superman from the 50s.
Right.
So it provides a good, when you're going into the culture, to understand these things. And so that's what we want to provide, is to provide these kinds of perspectives and clarity on whenever we go out. So anyway, well, this has been a great conversation, man. We're just so thrilled to have you on board and part of the team. And as always, with every one of these episodes, I invite all of our viewers and listeners to please check out everything we've got going on at the Word on Fire Institute. You can go to wordonfire.institute and you can partake in all of the courses that we have available. We had just mentioned that we just finished one on John Henry Newman from Bishop Barron himself. And of course, that's now readily available for our members to enjoy whenever they would like. We currently just launched a course by Father Stephen Gadberry. He is he's a Catholic priest out of Arkansas. And he actually competed on American Ninja Warrior. He's actually one of the best CrossFit athletes that I know. And he's getting into kind of it's called The People You Will Meet. So it's getting into like, who are some of the personalities you might run into and how might you use an evangelical, I hate to use the word strategy, but a platform with them, and what kind of relationship perhaps do they need. Also, when you sign up, you also get 4 copies a year of this beautiful journal, Evangelization and Culture. The next one's coming out, I believe, in March of this year. So again, go to wordonfire.institute and you can partake in all of the stuff we've got going on, exclusive content. You'll get even more from our new fellow of popular culture. So again, wordonfire.institute, and everybody have a great day. God bless.